Hello class, this is Mr. Gutierrez and I'm going to go over your presentation slides and agenda for the week. So like always, you can click on teacher narration if you want to see the screencast with my video, or you can always access the slides here just by yourself. So for your assignment, you're going to complete reconstruction notes, and you're going to use the PowerPoint slides as well as your U.S. History Alive Chapter 23 to help you fill that out. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. Basically, you have to fill in the blanks, and there's going to be two columns here. One of them is going to represent the progression of the Reconstruction era, and then the other one's going to represent the resistance to progress. So the 13th Amendment of 1865 made blank illegal in the United States. So you just read those, fill in the blank, use your books or your slides to help you fill them out. And you just have a couple of them to go through, and they're not very hard. So on the last question here, I want you to explain your answer. So after we go over the slides, I want you to think about whether you believe Reconstruction was more of a failure or a success. And please provide a couple sentences with your thinking. I really want to have you guys think about why Reconstruction was so important and whether you believe it was a failure or if it was a good thing overall. Okay, so on that note, let's get started with our PowerPoint slide here. So Reconstruction, it took place from 1865 to 1877. And what it was an era after the Civil War. So the country had just fought a bloody civil war in which 600,000 Americans lost their lives. And Reconstruction basically means that in the literal and a figurative sense, because the country was in ruins. As you can see by this image right here, buildings were crumbling, infrastructure, the economy wasn't that great, a lot of people lost their lives. But you also had to deal with the newly freed people. So about 4 million newly freed African Americans were in need of housing, of jobs, and they were given their freedom. But what do we do now? Where do we go? So we got to keep that in mind. And also, the Civil War was fought for a lot of ideological reasons too. The South wanted to preserve its grasp on the idea that people can own other people based on the color of their skin, so slavery. And to reconnect the country with those sorts of mentalities would prove problematic. So we're going to explore that a little bit deeper here. So the 13th Amendment was one of 3 new amendments that were going to be passed during the Reconstruction era. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery formally throughout the United States. So it was passed in January of 1865 and ratified on December of 1865. And if we read the sections here for the 13th Amendment, they abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. And what this means here is that slavery, of course, was abolished, and that was exactly what Abraham Lincoln wanted to do with his Emancipation Proclamation. However, the sentence here, except as a punishment for a crime, would be problematic in a couple of ways, because if slavery is abolished, but African Americans are criminalized and convicted of a crime, they could still be subject to a form of slavery where they are forced into labor and incarcerated and no longer have those rights guaranteed by the Constitution. So this simple sentence here would prove problematic in a number of ways, although the 13th Amendment was a good thing in the sense that it abolished slavery. So the 14th Amendment was the Second Amendment that was passed by Congress during the Reconstruction era, and this one granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, which included formerly enslaved people. So it guaranteed the equal protection, guarantees equal protection under the law. This would become the legal basis for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But overall, it just stated that people who were formerly slaves and were born in the United States were now considered citizens and no longer considered property like they were before the Civil War. The 15th Amendment. So this one meant that it granted African American men uh, the right to vote. And I say men because only men, white men, and African Americans up till this point had the right to vote. Women wouldn't be allowed to vote for another 50 years, um, up until 1920 during the suffrage movement. So it was very slow progress, obviously, for everyone to get equal rights under the law in the United States, but it was a step in the right direction. So, regardless of a person's race, color, or previous condition of servitude, meaning uh, previously enslaved, they can now have the right to vote and have some representation within the American government. Because, clearly they fought for their freedom during the Civil War, and they have worked for close to 200 years in the United States as slaves. So they are finally getting some sort of representation in the government's eyes. So another another thing that was instituted during the Reconstruction era was the Freedmen's Bureau, and this bureau helped former slaves and poor whites after the war. What it did things like it provided food, housing, medical aid. For free African Americans. It established schools and offered legal assistance for them as well. And it also tried to settle former slaves on land that was confiscated or that was abandoned during the Civil War. So it was a pretty ambitious program that was trying to get former slaves back on their feet and working, and also just give them opportunities that they just normally didn't have um, prior to the Civil War. Unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln's successor after his assassination, President Andrew Johnson, he was a former slave owner himself, and he was a racist by all means. So there wasn't very much motivation for him to continue programs like these. So, due to a lack of funding, a lack of personnel, along with the politics of race or racism, the Freedmen's Bureau was prevented from fully carrying out all of these programs that sought to improve the lives of newly freed slaves. Um, Another negative aspect during this era was the institution of black codes. So black codes were really restrictive laws that were designed to limit the freedom of African Americans. Um, the point was for them to still be relied on as like cheap labor. So an example of this would be that many states in the South would have African Americans sign yearly labor contracts, and if they refused to do that, they were arrested and forced to work. A lot of the opportunities that were provided to African Americans at this time were farming, anyways, and we're going to talk about sharecropping here in a bit too. And some other black codes that were instituted would be like vagrancy laws or loitering laws, which we still see today in a sense. So African Americans didn't have access to homes. A lot of them were unemployed, so they had nowhere to go. And what these vagrancy laws did was to criminalize homeless and unemployed African Americans. So they were subsequently arrested and forced into labor, which in essence is still a continuation of slavery. So even though they had some rights, like the rights to marry, the rights to vote, it was seen kind of like a mockery of this idea of emancipation that Abraham Lincoln had envisioned. So, like I mentioned before, sharecropping. This was a type of farming where former slaves rented small plots of land, and in return for a portion of their crop, they have to give some money or some portion of the profits to the owner of the land. So some of them luckily did make enough money to move from sharecropping to owning their own land, which was a positive thing. However, there were many downsides too, which we're going to discuss here. So most of them went into debt or were forced by poverty or threat of violence to sign unfair labor contracts. And this ultimately tied them to the land and just forced them to continue to work the land in order to repay that debt. So, like I said, they were bound to this land. It wasn't necessarily slavery, but it was a sort of a serf and peasant relationship that we started to see in the United States. So literacy tests and poll taxes were another way to oppress newly freed African Americans. Um, Literacy tests were administered when African Americans were registering to vote. So a lot of them did not have enough education to read. So this was heavily slanted and biased against them. So they could not even register or have access to voting because of these literacy tests. Also, poll taxes were required as payments in order to be able to vote. So this also excluded poorer African Americans from even being able to vote because they didn't have the money to be able to vote. And finally, this grandfather clause was another discriminatory law that was passed stating that if your grandfather was not free, a free person, then you were not even allowed to vote anyways. So clearly, African Americans who were formerly slaves would just by default not be allowed to vote. And this fell in line with another one of those black codes that were racist and discriminatory towards African Americans. So the South after Reconstruction, the Supreme Court uh, struck down a lot of these Reconstruction policies and laws that were put in place to help African American upward mobility. Um, a lot of the states in the South were now free to implement more restrictive black codes and things that we're going to see like Jim Crow laws. And here they mentioned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a Supreme Court ruling, which we're going to get into here in a second. Sorry, I kind of have to speed through this for the sake of time. So the Plessy versus Ferguson case was a case of segregation, meaning there were spaces reserved for whites, and then there were spaces reserved for blacks. Obviously, the whites had the more higher quality resources, and the blacks did not. So Homer Plessy was a black man who refused to give up his seat when he entered a white railroad car in Louisiana because he gave up he refused to do it. He was arrested. Eventually, the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the ruling was upheld that segregation was just because they were separate but equal. So it was voted 7-1, and Plessy ultimately lost. So we wouldn't see the reversal of this until 1954 when they desegregate the schools. So after Reconstruction, although there were a lot of good things, um, we did see a rise in black codes, Jim Crow laws, which would criminalize African Americans, deny them voting rights, deny them property rights. We would also see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the rise of violence against people of color. And the intentions of the 14th and 15th Amendment would not fully be realized until the Civil Rights era, close to 100 years later, during the 1960s. So that was Reconstruction in a very brief 15-minute video, but